Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert O'Meally from the Department of English, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, and the Center for JS Studies here at Columbia. I'm chair of this year's special campus-wide program called Such Sweet Thunder, Duke Ellington Plays Shakespeare. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. Before doing so, I want to say a few brief words about the Trilling seminars under whose auspices Professor Hortense Spillers will deliver her talk tonight. As many of you know, Lionel Trilling was one of Columbia's most brilliant and widely celebrated faculty members. Shortly after his death in 1975, the Trilling Seminar Series was founded to perpetuate his brand of high beam speculative inquiry. According to the original Trilling Seminars Committee, and I quote, "We look for scholars whose breadth and originality of mind can help the public understand what studies in the humanities can contribute to a clarification of the issues and value assumptions that underlie contemporary life. The committee seeks to identify scholars who are known both for original contributions to their own disciplines and for having addressed questions of major contemporary importance to both scholars and the educated public," end quote. Hortense Spillers is precisely the sort of scholar the original Trilling Seminars Committee had in mind. She's a richly gifted innovator of new tools and toolkits for cultural inquiry. Professor Spillers comes to us at a time when our Department of African and African Diaspora Studies is gaining momentum, building slowly and strongly and steadily on our campus. What a rare treat it is to have her as our speaker at this time. Responding to Professor Spillers' talk will be the respondents of life, if I may say so. Our own Professor Gayatri Spivak and our campus guest, Professor Rich Blint, both of whom I'll introduce as they come forward after Professor Spillers' talk. After our panelists have spoken, we'll have time for questions from the audience. You should see a Q&A box on your screen where you can submit your questions for me to read aloud to our participants. And now another word about Hortense Spillers. Let me say first, she's my friend and she's somebody, a kind of hero and friend, somebody I admire so much and whose kindness and brilliancy of mind I've admired for many years. She's the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English, Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She served as the M.H. Abrams Distinguished Visiting Professor in English at Cornell University from 1987 to 2006 and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences 2021. For the current academic year, she's been Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Soka University of America, Aliso Viejo, California. Her essay collection, Black, White, and in Color, Essays on American Literature and Culture, has been the subject of numerous critiques and conferences and conversations everywhere. She's currently at work on two large projects, The Idea of Black Culture and the Status of Women in the Revolutionary Context of the 18th Century. She's recently published work in the African American Review and Callaloo, the Bloomsbury Companion to Feminist Theory. In 2017, she launched the A-Line, a quarterly of progressive thought, and has been a recent recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from Callaloo and from the Caribbean Philosophical Association and the Hubbell Prize for Work in American Literature from MLA. She lectures widely, most recently as an international visiting fellow at the Institute for Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Social Justice and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Study at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. On a lighter note, I spent the morning trying to remember a student studying for his or her orals who did not list work by Hortense Spillers on his or her list of indispensable critical readings. It's been years since I've seen a list like that without her as one of the few indispensable readings for the orals. She has quicksilver wit and true wisdom. She says she started out wanting to be, as a young girl, she wanted to be president of the United States, and she told her family. As a child, she felt she could do a better job than Brother Eisenhower, she told her father. Then she wanted to write fiction and laughs in one of her essays that some people said that she was writing fiction when she was writing those essays of hers. And I'd like to emphasize that there's a certain amount of truth in that she is a deep truth teller whose sentences do achieve the momentum and delight in the power of words that mark great fiction. Critical creations echoing the traditions she loves, Ellison, Gwendolyn Brooks, Baldwin, Toni Morrison, fiction of shattering effect, fiction that's truer than the facts, theirs and hers. For like our best critics, she is fiction writerly in her splendidly crooked line searches for a new language to express what she's discovered, new forms of life, particularly in Black and feminist studies, fields where for years to come, can there be any doubt, she'll continue to be required reading. It's quite a pleasure now to bring forward wonderful Professor Hortense Spillers. Welcome.
Wow. Thank you so much, Bob. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. I want to thank you for inviting me to this forum. It's quite a signal recognition, and I deeply appreciate it. It's kind of humbling and scary as well. And it also gives me the opportunity to share this forum with two distinguished colleagues and friends, Professor Spivak and Professor Blint, and I thank them very much for consenting to be here. So, as it is an honor to be called upon to give the Trilling Lecture, it's also humbling and a little scary. As a matter of fact, I wish this were already over, but since it isn't, here we go. In keeping with Lionel Trilling's out-topping significance to humanistic study in the United States, I want to begin this talk with a tribute to another cultural critic in his function as a university teacher. W.E.B. Du Bois, along with Alexander Crummell, one of Du Bois's intellectual heroes, founded the American Negro Academy in 1897. This organization lasted well into the new century, and as far as I can tell, it was the first systematic effort to advance scholarship on African American life and thought. Du Bois's own Conservation of Races, for example, started its life as occasional paper number 2, 1897, delivered before the Academy. 1897 is also the year that Du Bois takes up a professorship in economics and history at Atlanta University and launches the series of studies, Atlanta University Studies, that examines various aspects of Black cultural practice, from the social and physical condition of Black people in cities. And it seems like that one anticipates Du Bois's work a couple of years later that resulted in the Philadelphia Negro. So we get incipient strains in that work. The series examined Black business enterprises, the Black church, and several other topics. I would call these projects proto-Black studies that are genuinely remarkable in their visionary insightfulness and their brazen assertion of the right of Black people to know, the right of Black people to a hermeneutic demand, which we actually hear as early, well, maybe as early perhaps as Phyllis Wheatley and certainly David Walker, among others. But I want to pay careful attention to the date 1897 because of its proximity to Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which was the year of the consolidation of United States apartheid and the Jim Crow South, that will essentially render moot the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and its legal protections. That year, Plessy makes those protections fundamentally inoperative to African Americans as the separate but equal doctrine becomes paradigmatic across the general field of social and political practice in national life. This final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction, which was itself nearly 20 years in the making, is accompanied by the inaugural chapter of domestic terrorism signaled by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is going to set in motion what likely remains the most massive internal migratory movement in the history of the United States, as Black Americans quite literally flee for their lives. It is not customary that we think of learning, of knowing things, of finding out things, of curricular development, if not in tandem with, then certainly not running parallel to violent movement, disruptive change. But Du Bois's intellectual career seems to me to begin in rupture and dislocation in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. This kind of thing gives the lie unwaveringly to the idea of academic life as an ivory tower, of academic life as an isolated feature of the social landscape. And I would go so far as to say that we might take Du Bois as a paradigmatic instance in more than one way, insofar as he encounters or intercepts intellectual protocol as a close neighbor to crisis, to trouble in the land. He is our brother. Almost exactly a century to the day of Du Bois's birth, latter-day Black studies would appear on the national and international horizon as a response to crises that Du Bois would witness as post-Reconstruction America. As far as he was concerned, it was the time of an American second birth, a second revolution, which he considered the rebirth of democracy, or at least he read Reconstruction in that way. It is astonishing to think about Du Bois, born 3 years after Appomattox. He missed the reversal of Plessy v. Ferguson in public accommodations by a year, having died uncannily on the very eve of the 1963 March on Washington. It is simply astonishing that we share a chapter of the autobiography of a race with Du Bois, the latter pages of an episode that he inscribed in the opening pages with his life and considerable gifts. In a sense, Black Studies picks up where Du Bois leaves off, yet in another sense, the Black Studies project engenders not only a break with Du Bois, but with the past, at least in its immediate registers. With regards to the latter, the Black Studies movement projected a scorched earth attitude toward aspects of the Black past. It had no interest whatsoever in conciliation with the elders and slow tolerance or low tolerance with its contemporaries who were not radical leaning or as radical leaning. I think it is fair to say that the tension generated between the forces of continuity and those in pursuit of an iconoclastic impulse might be considered the dual and dueling currents of practice and opinion that have prevailed in Black studies from its foundational moment to the present. But before I try to describe what this tension used to look like before it was ironed out in the interest of bureaucratic systematicity and academic pacification, which processes occur to formations as they age and settle onto a curricular landscape, I want to look a bit more at what I have called proto-Black studies. Our status now, more or less, represents a kind of settling. I don't know if some people might even want to call that a colony, but at least a settling. And the question is, how did we get here? What does it look like? In other words, Black studies have been normalized in a sense, having found a modicum of acceptance, having achieved a degree of accommodation to what is customary practice in an academic setting. It has taken half a century to get here. Another way to ask this is to say, now that we are here, where is that? We recognize Black studies movement as much by its styles of thought as by the particular year or years of practice. And in a very real sense, the only useful way to tell time here is to track it against modes of conceptualization and inquiry as these have unfolded since the late 1960s, early 1970s. For openers, when Black Studies programs were instaurated, they were imagined to be the continuation of combat on the other side of the barriers that had cordoned off protesters from the owners of the real estate that the university was perceived to inhabit. This scenario of combatants, antagonists, and protagonists suggests struggle which could only have happened because the university was thought of as other. Or is it that the protesters were? In the US context, we'd grown used to confrontation by the winter of 1969 because the owners of the real estate were white actors being coerced by Black actors to do something that they were expressly opposed to doing. And that is to say, ceding built space for the study of Black life and thought, which demand reflected on from this vantage decades later was fairly brazen in scope and intensity. I have called this the moment of Black studies when protest this morning attempts to translate itself into a curricular object later the same day. Perhaps it happened the same way at Columbia University as it did at Brandeis, where I was a first-year graduate student at the time and participating in a building takeover on the Waltham campus. This may well strike some listeners as shop-worn by now, but the reason why I dwell on it and over the years have kept coming back to it over and over again is the extent to which the inauguration of Black studies on predominantly white campuses remains an instance of who cuts the border, who breaches a barrier. And we well realize how terrifying a gesture this is, especially in the social logics of apartheid. And especially if we talked about the history of race relations in the United States from the point of view of real estate. And if we think about that in connection with the old sociological mapping, say, of Memphis, Tennessee, certain neighborhoods in the city where I grew up were not open to Black people to travel through easily when I was 16 years old, so that whenever I'm home these days and go through those neighborhoods, those old feelings come back. I shouldn't be here. But then it's all right now. At least it's all right in theory. But my sociological map of Memphis was different from that of my nieces and nephews. So real estate is an important idea, and especially in the social logics of apartheid, which prevailed in the United States officially until a little past the middle of the 20th century. 1968 is only 4 years, remember, removed from new civil rights legislation. It is also notable that this crossing over, by definition, a dangerous move and fraught with alienation, if not hatred, between and among historical actors caught up in it, involved a radical transfer of talent from one set of circumstance to another. It was not called Black Studies at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, where my two brothers went off to college in 1950, or at Tuskegee Institute in 1945 when my sister went off to college. At Tennessee State, it was called Negro History, in an institution whose personnel, faculty, staff, student body were all Black. A historian by the name of Merle Epps, a Black historian, wrote a textbook, The Negro in Our History. I think I remember. And I discovered this book among my brother's books when I was somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. I surmised years later that Merle Epps's book, and it was a good-sized hardback navy blue text that I'm seeing in my mind's eye even now, that this book had quite simply grown out of Carter G. Woodson's solicitations of 1916, when he founded the Journal of Negro History, and a decade later, when he inaugurated Negro History Week. Perhaps a little hagiographical in its motives, but nonetheless, inaugurated in February 1926. But Merle Epps was hardly working alone, as I've already mentioned the Atlanta University series and the rich, productive cultural work proceeding along a waterfront of activity. But it occurs to me that the main reason why this flourishing creativity is so muted and undermined is that revanchist violence threatens the lives and fortunes of Black people all the time, with dizzying, unrelenting intensity that characterizes post-Reconstruction America and beyond. I remember with great fondness the receipt of newspapers in my father's and mother's house, the Memphis dailies, the Memphis Commercial Appeal in the AM, the Pressimeter, the Memphis Pressimeter in the PM. But Memphis's Black population was essentially at war with these newspapers whose journalistic practices were fundamentally hostile to Black interests, to Black personality. But at the time, a vital national Black press made all the difference. And in the Spillers household, the Pittsburgh Courier, with its beautiful sepia-toned, large format photographs, its syndicated columns by the likes of George Schuyler, Melvin Tolson, and its humor that included the wisdom of Hambone and Langston Hughes's Jesse B. Simple, opened to my young eyes the wide world that had in it Ralph Bunche, who was the first Nobel Prize winner of any sort that I ever knew anything about. Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder, one of the founders of Bethune-Cookman. Thurgood Marshall, Marian Anderson, Heidi Ho Callaway, as well as Benjamin O. Davis Jr., long before General Colin Powell, and a beautiful Hazel Scott with her slick, crooked, elegant husband, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And I could go on, but the point I am making will be quite obvious, so obvious that it needs repeating. And that is to say that Black studies were a particular invention for white audiences in its specific guise as the other side of a barrier called the white university or the university of the mainstream. What I am suggesting is that Black communities had Black studies by other names in its newspapers, its churches, its public schools and colleges, its occasional papers, its lodges, conventions, sororities, fraternities, for decades and decades, even as Dorothy Sterling, in her wonderful book, We Are Your Sisters, reports on self-help activity pursued by Black women in Northern communities long before the abolition of slavery. If, however, you decide that this legacy is negligible, you might forget about it in agonistic struggle with owners of other property, which expense of energy assumes that they have access to something that you need and want when the truth might be other. And if I could stop a moment just to look at a short passage from Fred Moten's, from Professor Moten's Undercommons. And I thought of this passage as I was writing this passage in the talk. He is talking in an interview that he and Stefano Harney do that ends at the very end of Undercommons. And he's talking about something called the Mississippi Freedom Schools in the mid-1960s. And he's saying that there are two questions that one asked about this Mississippi project that Black folk were launching in 1964. And that is, what do the owners have that they want or need? But he says that's the second question, what do we want to keep? And he says this, what the second question presupposes is A, that they've got something that they want to keep, the Black folk, and B, that not only do those people who were fucking them over not have everything, but that part of what we want to do is to organize ourselves around the principle that we don't want everything they have. I think that's a pretty remarkable statement. Anyway, so this access, it's not all the goodies are on the other side. I mean, the truth is other, and that is to say that Blackness or Africanity as an object of knowledge, as a curricular object, is coming, or by that moment, it is coming to lose its status as a secret in a closet or a mark of prohibition, a mark of deprivation. So there we were in a sort of beginning, which also described a rupture in the sense that it was a crossing over into forbidden territory, and continuation in demarking a hermeneutic demand that we had known about for a long time. I suppose it would be accurate to say that Black studies as a heuristic or epistemological project has always tended to be historically configured events, names, dates, places, out of the strong conviction that facts in their linear configuration undo myths and lies. But I also suspect that the work carried out by Woodson, Du Bois, and other scholars in the late 19th century and beyond, in their devotion to racial advocacy and defense, inspired a historical imagination which flows directly into the 20th century and the Black Studies protocol. Historical imagination is no stranger to narrative and to poetics, so that in tandem, early Black Studies programs, and few, if any of them, began their journey as degree granting departments, tended to feature courses in history, literature, and sociology, all of them with their respective disciplinary commitments, but all of them anxious to honor Black people in history, since they had been written out of it, except as the embodied projecting screen or mechanism of global wretchedness. I would identify what could be called two historical visions that decided not only what courses you taught, but what you valued. These tendencies, it would appear, are now rather muted in the curricular of Black studies, but in the late 60s to the mid 70s and a little beyond, teacherly attitudes ran along an Afrocentric current or track and a Black Atlantic one. In the first instance, the transatlantic slave trade to and from the sub-Saharan continent was only a chapter in a long narrative that did not accord slavery pride of place in its analysis. The Afrocentrists start their reading of history with ancient African kingdoms. For the Afrocentrists, this is no simple reading, it is existential revelation. This view of things carried tremendous appeal because A, it was not, quote, the university and was not perceived to be, quote, white in any way whatsoever, but more than that, Afrocentrism matched the romantic allure of the Black radical streets, perceived to be closer to something called Black community, tracking at least in resonance with the fresh memory of Malcolm El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz and the impressive political choreography of the National Black Panther Party. However different and differentiated these actors and principles were, they all agreed that human dignity was as necessary to Black personality as oxygen, as material acquisition. Interestingly enough, those of us who were critical of Afrocentricity had to agree with aspects of it, finding occasional synonymity between aspects of Herodotus and Malefi Asante. One had a few second thoughts. The Black Atlantic reading starts its reel in the mid 15th century with populations that will shortly be called Black rather than African. The distinction that I'm drawing here is not trivial or ocious, insofar as it constitutes one of the nodal points at which Blackness and Africanity break in twain. Amiri Baraka might have been joking halfway when he says somewhere in Blues People, I believe it is, that the African American was born the afternoon that the African looked up from his hole into the face of the burning sun and said, "I'm tired of this mess." In short, climate, culture, languages, religions, systems of naming, patterns of kinship, for example, all radically shift in the fateful transport of millions of human beings over 5 centuries from one continental landmass to another. As I'm reading it, that 500-year interval marks considerable difference. I didn't say definitive. And the difference between considerable and definitive is considerable, right? Because one opens the pathway to Pan-Africanism, to diasporic thinking, and so forth. For the Afrocentrists, those differences are elided, if not effaced. As we would anticipate, Black studies, whatever its self-descriptions might project, have sustained a high degree of porosity. Pressure has honed in on these protocols from many different directions, some of them from a putative, quote, outside, some of them internal to the programs. From outside, 2 dates stand out, 1966 and 1976, even though both of these dates will impact humanistic study in the US Academy and in the global academy, more broadly speaking. In 1970, Johns Hopkins University Press brought out the Structuralist Controversy, The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man, edited by Richard Maxey and Eugenio Donato. The text was actually a record of the proceedings of an international symposium that was convened at Johns Hopkins in 1966 on questions concerning the uses of structuralism across the disciplines, and a good number of European intellectuals and some of the repertoire of ideas that would come to reconfigure modes of conceptualization and scholarship that would prevail in the Western Academy for the next half century were there. And these attendees included René Girard, Georges Poulet, Svetlana Todorov, Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Lucien Goldman, among others. Fast forward a decade, in summer 1976, yours truly, a newly minted PhD and a joint appointment second-year assistant professor of English and Black Studies at Wellesley College, turns up at the inaugural session of a new initiative in higher education, I suspect inspired by the Hopkins event. This new initiative was called the School of Criticism and Theory, hosted by Ralph Friedman and Murray Krieger, and convened on the campus of the University of California, Irvine, where we were taking classes from René Girard, Hayden White, listening to lectures by Edward Said, Fred Jameson, Frank Commode, reading very strange books by somebody named Michel Foucault, and the book called The Order of Things. And well, I would have to say that my fellows and I were intimidated nearly to death, but that was only half of it. At that time, we were informed about a text entitled Of Grammatology that had been translated by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, and that textual gesture was the intellectual equivalent of a tsunami with vast implications for the range of the human sciences. Now, it would not be immediately apparent that the convergence in preparation at that very moment would bring together passion and method in ways that no one could have anticipated at all. Outside, meets inside because Black studies had a reckoning coming with regards to gender arrangements and inequities, perhaps beautifully captured in Barbara Smith's, Patricia Bell Scott's, and Gloria Acacia Hall's title, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, 1983, which might be considered one of the founding texts of Black feminist critique. Please bear in mind that these occurrences are so tightly woven and plaited together in my mind that it is nearly impossible for me to separate them analytically. But what I want to suggest is that working the pulse of the nerve was the desire to create Black studies, to create and practice a field at once. I think it is what made my colleague, for instance, Houston Baker, become an African Americanist, not opposed to a Victorianist, but other than. Or my dear friend and colleague, Lucius Outlaw, to choose to step into Africana philosophy, which I don't think even existed before the 1980s. In short, we were trying to name an old object of study in a brand new guise and needed methods or epistemes for doing so, and found them, at least in part, in the epistemological revolution sweeping across the Atlantic. And it was indeed a serendipitous meeting. Title IX legislation, 1972, which protects subjects from discrimination based on sex in educational programs or activities that receive federal aid, was a boost to a women's studies curriculum. But the latter, as in women's movement of the 19th century, flowed in tandem with Black movement, with Black studies. So that 1968, 69, with its Black agitation, with its Vietnam War protest, embodied a waterfront of left movement manned by young people in different parts of the globe that rendered class attendance in those days a quite sporadic proposition. So the structuralist and theoretical turn as a general methodological overview, which consolidated scholarly work in Black studies, which in turn inspires women's studies and feminist theory, will eventually conduce cultural studies where we are now. This period may be regarded as the merger of disciplines, or more precisely, the evaporation or attenuation of disciplinary lines. I'm not sure we've quite gotten to interdisciplinarity yet. We think we have, but I'm just not sure. We've certainly gotten to attenuated disciplinary lines, so that Black studies, as I read it, opened a path to women's and feminist studies, gender and sexuality studies, queer studies, trans, disability, environmental, climate, algorithmic, critical race theory, Afro-pessimism, etc. Where we're headed is predicated on where we think we are, and to my mind, where we are is falling off a cliff. Black studies, of course, are not alone in this. The age of surveillance capitalism, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power. Shoshana Zuboff's study of the new social media names one of our gravest problems at the moment, which necessitates, in the most circuitous way, a critique of technology, and perhaps at bottom, the entire STEM protocols. Climate change and the unmaking of the planet, the corporatization of the university, in which case critical interrogation and writing are not really safe and valued even there. and the one that quite literally keeps me awake until daybreak most days. How do we regard renewed attacks on the ballot and the ubiquitous threats of violence that proceed from what looks like a massive psychotic break at the level of society, as it looks like a fifth column is forming in the United States? So, do Black studies have a special role to play in these circumstances that signal a cancerous rot at the very core of the systems we have worked within all our lives? My thought here, I'm afraid, is quite naive and childlike. Perhaps Black studies can take up the mantle of prophecy, and I both know what I mean by that and do not know what I mean by that, but some of it has to do with the act of insight, of clarity about where we are. And I have always depended on that. Thank you. Thanks very much.
There we are. Sorry
right.
about that. Yeah, I was just, basically I was saying amen, and you got me worried, both in the same breath. Our first respondent here will be Professor Rich Blint, a favorite member of the New York City Columbia extended faculty family, if ever there was one. You can easily find his bio online. I'll just give a few highlights so we can move quickly. He's assistant professor of literature in the Department of Literary Studies, director of the program in race and ethnicity, and affiliate faculty in gender studies at the Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts at the New School here in New York. Professor Blint is one of the planet's most sought after and learned scholars of James Baldwin, co-editor of a special issue of African American Review on Baldwin. He wrote the introduction and notes for the ebook Baldwin for Our Time, Writings from James Baldwin for a Time of Sorrow and Struggle, and served as guest critic for a special Baldwin issue of the Brooklyn Rail. His upcoming books include A Radical Interiority, James Baldwin and the Personified Self in Modern American Culture, and A Queer Spirit, Incidents in the Life of Americas. He's co-editor of the forthcoming volume of African American Literature in Transition, 1980 to 1990, and editor-at-large for the A-Line, a journal of progressive thought. He is mon frère, Professor Rich Blint. Welcome, Rich.
Good evening, Bob. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to begin by saying, wow, to what we just witnessed. Hortense, that was incredible. But first, some procedural stuff, a kind of formality, which I think will keep us in good stead. It's an honor to be part of this remarkable conversation. Before I proceed, please allow me to offer thanks to the staff of the Heyman Center and the Center for Jazz Studies for your organizational acumen. Thanks are also due to Professors O'Mealy, Spillers, and Galili for the invitation to respond to this year's remarkable Trilling Lecture. And of course, special appreciation must be extended to this year's speaker, who we just heard and bowled us over, Hortense J. Spillers, for her decades-long legacy of rigor, mentorship, and critical generosity. Hortense, your work, it seems to me, and I think for all of us, and Progressive Spirit has shaped a generation of scholars who not only venture wide in their practices of Black diasporic criticality, but also go deep as they seek to set down the necessary roots, those fundamental first questions which constitute a discipline, the discipline of African American studies. I was going to begin, I should tell everyone, with a clip from a documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, which features the occupation of Ford Hall in 1969, January 8th, 1969, as a way to kind of bring that story into the room. And in beginning that, I remembered something that Hortense says It's a kind of well-worn tale, but it's a necessary one. And I remember that she broke out in hives. Hortense J. Spillers broke out in hives. Upon hearing that the National Guard or the state police could storm the building, Ford Hall, at any time, Hortense Spillers, a member of the occupying body of students at Brandeis University's Ford Hall on January 8, 1969, developed urticaria, a skin reaction triggered by other things, stress. And that stress is the apartheid violence that Professor Spillers spoke so eloquently and kind of vividly about, right? A young Black woman from the Memphis, Tennessee geography that was spoke about before. A young graduate student in the English department had joined the ranks of a movement of young people across the country, insisting that the disciplined study of the history and present of Black people was not only a worthwhile curricular endeavor, but whose instantiation might assist. And I want to say to Hortense's last question, what's the use of Black studies now, might assist in the establishment of peace in a revolutionary moment of violent contraction, then as now. In the immediate aftermath of all those shameful American assassinations, the students had 10 non-negotiable demands. And the first one was obvious, right? The establishment of an African studies department with the power to hire and fire. This means for them that the committee must have an independent budget of its own. We all know those very distinct demands that most recently resulted in instantiation of the department at Columbia University. It goes on to talk about different things, including the expulsion of a white student who had fired a BB gun at a Black student, one of the causes of all this. The demands were specific to local events, as I'm elaborating now, but shared a national mood. And they won. On April 24th of 1969, the faculty at Brandeis approved the African and Afro-American department. On April 30th of 1969, Ronald Waters is announced as chair of African and Afro-American Studies Department. So there's a moment of success, right? But there is this question again, what happens when you are creating curricular objects in a moment of crisis, right? Building something while you're imagining it. This is the question. And so if we move forward, we have 1966, 1976. I want to take us a bit forward to 1994, where we have the beginnings of two interventions by our speaker tonight. I'm referring, of course, first to the Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, a post-date, which appears in Boundary 2 in 1994. And much of the questions that are presented here now about the kind of precipice-like characteristics or features of contemporary African-American studies turn up here. And I want to quote, and if you'll allow me just a little bit, what Hortense Spillers says here. Quote, distracted by falls or secondary issues, today's Black creative intellectual lends herself, himself, like candy being taken from child to the mighty seductions of publicity and the pinup, rather like what an editor of Lingua Franca only recently half jokingly dubbed once upon a time, the African American du jour. Might it be useful then to suggest that before the Black creative intellectual can heal her people, she must consider to what extent she must heal herself? That before the Black creative intellectual can offer a salvic program against crack and crack up, 1994, crack and crack up, that characteristic humor and play, rhetorical play, literary play of Spillers that Bob talked about at the beginning. She is called upon, Hortense Spillers says, to undergo a conversion herself. And is it too much to imagine that what is wrong with the community, we talk about the split and the alienation of community and Black creative intellectuals in the supposed ivory tower, that what is wrong with the community is wrong with oneself. And furthermore, One could submit that a Black creative intellectual, like the Black musician whom she so admires, has an object, in fact, but that she's not always interested in what it is. So that's the first thing I want to say. I don't have an awful lot of time, so I want to put three more things on the table. And so the other moment from this essay that, before we move on to 2007, is this idea that certain fatalism, right? The idea of the precipice need not be the outcome. And that we're called upon, Spillers suggests, to reinstitute the centrality of Harold Cruz's interrogation. What is the work of the Black creative intellectual for all we know now? For all that we know now, what's the work of the Black creative intellectual? And I think what we need to know at the very beginning, what Hortense said earlier, is that what is really at stake is symbolic power, the power to name and to define. This comes in an interview with Keith Leonard and Callaloo in 2007. So Hortense, as I said, Professor Spillers has been at this for some time, the central question of what is Black studies. The goal is nothing less, as was talked about today, given the rise of the fifth column, given all those ruptures and dislocations, that is nothing less than rewriting of Western history. Just rewrite it, she says, and not lie in that Baldwinian way, tell the truth. To elaborate on and to enrich it with that which has been purposefully occluded and maligned. That's number one, right? But number two, as I said earlier, is that there's a kind of first question. The first objective is to establish contemporary intellectual identity for Black studies, right? Which meant opening a kind of long corridor with other disciplines. Disciplines that would rather see you go somewhere else. They still do, with kind of benign neglect or actively hostile postures. But the protocol was always, you don't belong here, get out of here. But what Spillers has always insisted from all this time in all these writings about African-American studies is that I'm going to stay here and you're going to have to deal with me, right? What is also crucial here, we talk about the pinup, is that the Black Studies Project is not about any one individual, but rather it is a set of protocols that run through individuals. That's really quite key. Like the root of those first questions, again, is really kind of important. And I think that can steel us against what we find now, which is the absence of a kind of left progressivism on, let's say, the white side. It is true, it seems to me, what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney say, that we don't need nothing in some ways, except for this idea of private property, the university, which often finds itself in low-income neighborhoods and have this hostile ongoing relationship to those, native populations, if you'll forgive me, right? And so we have to labor in our minds and our heart to think about the profound, noisy absence of an identifiable intellectual left in the nation and what that does to the Black Studies Project. And what is also, I think, central here, and I don't have a great deal of time, is a couple of things, right? What are the generational legacies of Black studies? What is precisely being critiqued if we can identify a school of thinking? If everything is a trend, if everything is just popping up, and then we kind of play a kind of dancing chairs, how do we come back to a set of first questions that identify itself and take root at a certain set of disciplinary protocols that a whole range of things run through? How can we identify what that is, to name it? Again, the power and the need for symbolic power to name and to define. I don't have very much time, but I'll say one last thing about how we prepare the ground for future scholarship. It's a question I have more than anything else, right? The realization that our position at this moment in the university, this corporatized university, is not necessarily about one person's individual ascendancy, simply that someone prepared the ground for you. That's what I've learned from Professor Spillers. But how do we prepare the ground for everybody else who's coming behind us in the heat and the fire and the thicket, right, of revanchism, of violence, of a burning, flooding climate? How do we deal with that? And the very last thing is this question of the importance of the idiomatic if we prioritize diaspora. How does that change what we mean now, not at the decolonial moment of the late 1950s and 60s, but now, how does the embrace of diaspora reconfigure our sense of the possible in African-American studies in contemporary life? Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rich. Given us, we're going over a lot of ground kind of quickly, but we'll come back and have time for people to respond a bit more. But thank you for your response. Our second responder is none other than Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She's university professor here at Columbia and a founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. With a BA in English, first-class honors, Presidency College, Calcutta, PhD in comparative literature from Cornell. She's also the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and the winner of the Kyoto Prize in Thought and Ethics 2012, and a Lifetime Achievement Award in Scholarly Achievement from the Modern Language Association of America 2018, as well as many other badges of distinction from our field. Her books include studies of Yeats, of Derrida, of Gramsci, of Mahasweta Devi, and others. She's a celebrated translator and the author or editor of De la Grammatologie in Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics, Selected Subaltern Studies, The Post-Colonial Critic, Interviews, Strategies, Dialogues, Thinking Academic Freedom Engendered Post-Coloniality, Outside in the Teaching Machine. Her writing is collected in the Spivak Reader but is available very, very widely. New work includes Death of a Discipline, Other Asias, and Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization, as well as various publications of Marxist cultural theory in Bengali. Her much anticipated new book is called Walking with Du Bois, which many of us are watching for and waiting for very, very eagerly. Gayatri Spivak personifies the scholar as activist, most visibly in rural, educational, and feminist and ecological social movements since 1986. She is the scholar activist. She's a senior scholar, university professor at Columbia in the full sense of that title. In other words, she's mentor of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who've come through our campus and those who have come on and through the campus. She's the teacher of the teachers here at Columbia and at home and abroad. And so it's with great pleasure that I present my neighbor, my friend, my much admired colleague, Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Welcome, Gayatri.
You're muted.
Am I still muted?
You're good.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, it's very hard to actually follow such an introduction. This is a tame talk. Hortense is a very old friend, and really it's hard to follow Rich's impassioned act. I'll do my best, Hortense. You shared with us that you would develop in your essay what you had begun to think about in 1974 in your Alumni Achievement Award speech of 2019. And Rich also, I really thank Rich for making it available to me. And so I want to begin with what you say at the end of that speech, Hortense. Today you said that you would end in the mode of prophecy. And in fact, you made a prophecy at the end of that speech, which I want to hang on to. I quote, "As one of the locuses of Black culture, Black studies, by centering a particularity, takes hold of something larger, and that is to say, the concept of culture itself." And perhaps we can talk about this later, and that later is today. Are we bound for the day when Black studies are everybody's studies? Question mark. You have given me a place there. Are we bound for the day when Black studies are everybody's studies? You were with Barbara Smith, who thought identity a bit later, which our own Kimberly Crenshaw rewrote as intersectionality, and cheap intersectionality is what you really have focused on so that it works in its proper way. But you were thinking about it already for a little while in 1974. And I need that place, the place that you give me. Today more than ever. Look at our group, yourself, Bob O'Meally, Rich Flint, and I, the only one not of African origin. I can start from your welcome. When Abiola Irele asked me to introduce his last great book, The African Intellectual, published only in Lagos, rather than asking another Nigerian intellectual or even an African intellectual, I felt the same terrified delight that I had done something right. Why did Biola ask me? A great deal can be said here, but I will simply cite something from Du Bois, and I quote you, the Black New Englander who was on course nearly a century ago. He had wanted not only to be a Negro, but also to speak to and speak for everyone. Right after he finished his dissertation, he wrote, I quote, I was dissatisfied with my study of the slave trade because it ended too abruptly and yielded too narrow a field for valid judgment of human action. If I could study what man had done, why not investigate thoroughly and scientifically what he was doing now and what he might do in the future? In other words, I was seeking a science of human action which could be used not only for studying the Negro problem, but for all the problems of the poor and ignorant. And that's your line, Hortense. This intramural critique does create a double bind. I have supported Nahum Chandler's thought that the problem of the Negro is a problem for thought for this very reason. But you have to admit that there is a double bind here, even as we recognize that identity politics is perhaps an ideological requirement of the abstract movement of globalized capital. We cannot give up an identity that has been secured with such difficulty. I was born in British India, so I can say it also from another context. We cannot give up an identity that has been secured with such difficulty. Yet, brand name degrees, such as from Vanderbilt or Columbia, have long been instruments of upward class mobility. We must accept and interrogate the fact that Black studies can participate in this class separation. How then do we combat this ensemble? Outside the academy, some of us think, and I'll go there. Turning protest into curriculum, what happens, you ask? In the 60s, we learned some lessons about this, you remember, repressive tolerance. Hortense and I are almost the same age. She's a bit younger than I am. So we've actually gone the same way. Raymond Williams' dynamic sense of the dominant as defined by ceaseless appropriation of the emergent, as it is forced into mere alternative from the actively oppositional as it enters the academy. The lines shifting is still useful. As you remind us, and I quote you, Hortense, because you're right in line with this, the degree to which cooperation can be distinguished from complicity or consensus from compromise calls for discernment of the nicest sort. I like that, the nicest sort. There's Bob O'Mealy's comment on your Anrich's, on your use of language, nicest sort. You have complicated this through your thinking of the intramural, bringing in auto-critique by way of Fanon's, quote, self-deceived Negro of the Antilles. You speak of evolving a language, I quote, appropriate to the subjects differently. I'm with you, but would speak of subject constitution by rearranging desires rather than language evolution. With the final articulation of intramural critique, I'm totally on the same page. And I'm quoting, now it's a long title, right? All the things you could be by now if Sigmund Freud's wife was your mother, Psychoanalysis and Race, one of the absolutely indelible lectures that we must go back constantly to. As you have said there, with the final articulation of intramural critique, I'm totally on the same page. I quote, "My history must not imprison me. Once I recognize it for what it is," which you once again assign to Fanon, "I feel pretty sure that you distinguish between cognition and recognition." I wish we could have a long chat about this right now, but not possible. In 2000, you claimed that Black studies were over because of the absence of this intramural autocritique. And indeed, if one looks at, and now I'm looking at Black feminist studies, there's a good question about this I've already noticed. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. The Black women studies, also this bridge called My Back in 1982, we see that they were also critiquing Black studies. They also shared some of the problems inherent in turning protest into curriculum. I quote, "Unfortunately, as women's studies has become both more institutionalized and at the same time more precarious within traditional academic structures, the radical life-changing vision of what women's studies can accomplish is constantly being diminished in exchange for acceptance, respectability, and the career advancement of individuals. This trend in women's studies is a trap that Black women's studies cannot afford to fall into." Their solution is, I quote, "to explore the experience of supposedly ordinary Black women whose unexceptional actions enabled all in the race to survive." If there were time, I would discuss how this actually cannot finally be a goal. Yours is subject constitution through intramural critique, which can let me in. Mine is combat outside the academy. We must disciplinarize, and yet we must also find a way to undermine the demands of disciplinarization. How is this done? Perhaps by sharing in coursework the production of the rules that we must follow in order to produce the course and the philosophy of reading. But this cannot take too much of the time away from the substance of the course. Another way would be not to pretend that the class is a piece of activism. Many people do this. That the class is a piece of activism beyond the fact of the critique of disciplinarity. We should remember that in the classroom, we can only teach how to know the object of knowledge as well as we can. We can't run away from it. This method of teaching would be particularly difficult with undergraduate required courses in Black studies. I think in those situations, we must give as much of the teaching of the class toward the students, to the students as possible, so that we gently guide them to where they would be if they were really doing it themselves. I hope very much that the students, and this is hard, would not be only Black. The fact that the Black students will react differently to the contents, and even then, depending on whether they are recent or long-term African Americans, should become part of the content of the class. And this too is hard. As Sharon E. Charles says, working with gangs and druggies clear outside of the academy, and I quote a very powerful woman. And if we are thinking that this is going to happen overnight because we want it to, it is in our hearts. We no longer want shootings. We'll tell everybody, put the guns down, but there's got to be some alternatives to that. And that work happens every single day. You don't get a break from it. Changing the mindset of someone, you cannot get a break from it. This realization that you can't just have the desire in the classroom of, everybody is decolonizing these days, and they write about 6 emails to me every day. What can I say? At any rate, I want to use her, Sharon E. Charles, as a gentle reminder as the university wants to appropriate the outside of the academy. You were talking about corporatism, etc. As the humanities are being given a hatchet job, the university is also appropriating the outside of the academy. There is so much activity in the Black movement outside the academy today, against voter suppression that you were talking about. There is movement in outside the academy today, as there wasn't in the 80s. So that Black movement outside the academy today, that in fact, I say about George Floyd, the subaltern spoke. The subaltern could speak. He died, but he spoke because the ground was prepared. There was infrastructure within the Black movement so that it could work. And I think, therefore, outside of the academy is ready, that intramural critique can be powerfully active there, because Hortense knows that we can't romanticize the outside. The intramural critique can travel there. If we can learn how to earn the right to learn how to speak. I remember when I was speaking, I also don't have much time, but Bob did say that he would be easy. I'm just going as fast as I can. But I remember when I was invited as an ethnocultural agenda on the World Global Day for the Occupy folks, okay? Remember that mic going, people's mic, people came up to me and said, so many professors had spoken to us and we didn't understand anything. Who are you? We understood what you were saying. And I said to them, because I know I've earned the right. I'm also a political person. This is outside the academy. You don't say the same thing, same way. So therefore we have to earn the right to learn how to speak. Otherwise, easy intersectionality closes doors. Let's just share this bit of wisdom from Maurice Condé. I quote, "The world in which we live today is one of violence, terrorism, globalization. In that context, and again, one must say farewell to the university before it is too late." I mean, she's clear out. We are not clear out. But the university must be supplemented in order to turn protest into curriculum. How do we save it? For some of us, it's with work outside the academy, not appropriated by the university. I'm also deeply sympathetic with your idea that Black studies had already existed before it was established as such at white universities. You began with the wonderful American Academy, which I was going to mention, but you really spoke about it, and Crummell is a very, very important figure. Can't go there now. That Black studies, there is a little bit about him in Soul of Black Folks, which is very different from the Crummell that we know. It's a fantastic piece. You have given wonderful examples, etc. But I do want to mention, again, particularly Du Bois's extraordinary project at Atlanta University, because what he was doing, and this is what I'm offering against just evolving language, he was constituting a middle-class subject. He was not just having Black studies. This thing, this is, Surya, move on. If you look at the table of contents, and he took this with him to Accra, you'll see the background, the development of cooperation, types of cooperation. I mean, it goes down, and this is just one of the many things that he did, many schools of this, events of this sort that he organized. Keep going. Sorry, yes. You see, the conference regards the economic development of the Negro Americans at present as in a critical state. The crisis arises not so much because of idleness or even lack of skill, or by reason of the fact that they unwittingly stand hesitating at the crossroads, one way leading to the old trodden ways of grasping fierce individualistic competition, where the shrewd, cunning, skilled, and rich among them will prey upon the ignorance and stupidity and simplicity of the mass of the race and get wealth at the expense of the general well-being, the other way leading to cooperation in capital and labor, the massing of small savings, the wide distribution of capital, and a more general equality of wealth and comfort, redistribution. He's trying to construct a citizen subject who will have a general desire for social justice. Okay, move. This study, which forms the 12th of the annual publications of Atlanta University and the second investigation of the new decade, is a further carrying out of a plan of social study by means of recurring decennial inquiries into the same general set of human problems. The object of these studies is primarily scientific, careful search for truth conducted as thoroughly, broadly, and honestly as the material resources and mental equipment command will allow. But this is not our sole object. We wish not only to make the truth clear, but to present it in such shape as will encourage and help social reform. This idea of constituting a subject is where I really learn from Du Bois, and it goes much further than this. I would like to share in closing something about Africa here. And this is not the romantic allusion, not Malcolm El-Shabazz, whom I truly respect. I live very close to where he was killed. And as I walk by every day, I think of the young man walking in, and I met him, and I saw him, met him. I actually sat at the same table at Telluride, with, in fact, Leroy Jones, as he was then, and him, because he came to talk at Cornell in '62, right? And I was there at Cornell, a soft-spoken, wonderful man, Malcolm. But and I felt like before that, it was all Allen Ginsberg, India. And India I didn't know, but I was young, I fell into it. I sang with him on the harmonium. But once I sat there and listened to Malcolm, I thought, my goodness, this is like the Calcutta I know. I remember thinking that, '62. But anyway, so this is not that romantic stuff. I greatly appreciate your reading of the Oedipe Africain, because I want to tell you that that Du Bois was, in fact, in the last years of his life, he was constituting a new subject through his encyclopedia, the books he bought, etc., a new African subject of Pan-Africanism. He never stopped moving and growing. And that's where I kind of try, with no teaching, to follow him through. This is my last movement. I greatly appreciate your reading of the Oedipe Africain, based in Senegal, but of course that is Ifriqiya, and we do not know Wolof, crucial for psychoanalysis of a Wolof speaker. And of course, Wolof is only one of Africa's wealth of languages. We should also note one of the problems of Pan-Africanism, that a small cluster of ethnic groups will call itself Africa, Oedipe Africain. I have been working with an Africa-led group now for 12 years, investigating the African languages that the missionaries did not systematize. Here, earning the right to speak as an outsider is more demanding. And the main problem is, how were these languages written on namic substances, head computer, digitizing on the head computer before artificial intelligence? How were they taught? I'm sorry I cannot share with you the difficulties of earning the right here. I could give you many examples. Here now is my fantasy of Black studies beginning long ago. Perhaps the work started long ago as the Bantu mother tongues, with dialectal similarities and constituted by multilinguality, moved down the east flank of the continent and proceeded by conjunctural displacements. Pan-Africanism, before Africa, before Ifriqiya, Du Bois comes into it by a long and intense sublation of Africa as no more than the origin of the African American. Mamadou Diouf has been, well, he's from Senegal, has been my mentor in learning the differences between the African Europeans and the African American. And Nahum Chandler phenomenalizes the African American. Africa is the name of what was outside. Diaspora is the throwing of that seed outside of that outside. It will mark difference, not only in general ontology, but also in the originary historiality of the vanishing present. Our time will pass tracking it. The thing that I really want to be able to think is the mathematical spirit in orality, in that digitizing before Du Bois had thought of the historical spirit. It's not like these things don't exist. I want to be able to imagine the move from orality to so-called literacy, as Brooke Rose does, I quote, data withdrawal symptoms, thinking of orality as namic digitization before the digital. There is much more to say, Hortense. I wish I could go on and on, but I now remain to be instructed by the other participants as well as the Q&A. Thank you. And Bob, thank you for letting me go a little bit over time.
Well, we're lucky to have you take the time that you did, and we wish you had more. And one way to look at today's event is as an invitation to follow through and read some of the things that have been mentioned on the screen and have been mentioned in passing by our wonderful participants. We do have have questions, I believe, from our audience. I might, as the questions are assembled, just say that the question of how to make radical change, to make revolutionary change in the institutions where we work is vexing and always a challenge. How do we turn over the soil in a situation where we are becoming increasingly settled, and we are the settlers, I fear, all the time. And anyway, the lessons in the air and the books that we're to follow up on now are very clear. I don't see the questions that we're to consider. Maybe one way to begin now would be to risk putting Hortense on the spot. And you've heard these different comments. Could you take a moment and tell us what you've thought of the responses that you've gotten?
Yes, I thought they were amazing. I would like to see them. I would like to see them written down, because I thought they were complex and broadened what I was talking about in my presentation. I think Rich was saying that he had footage to show about the takeover at Ford Hall. I didn't know that he had remembered that I told him about the hives, but it's true. Yes. And Rich's question is my question. What's next? And I think maybe that might be the question that is refused if you're in a settlement, or if you've settled. There is no what's next. I mean, it's kind of like a stop sign. And I think that's what we want to remove in relationship to Black studies. And what Gayatri was saying about orality and the digital before the digital, I would like to hear more about that from her. That's very interesting, because I think it's a way to talk about Black studies in a temporal frame that's even older than introducing Du Bois to the picture, or even Phyllis Wheatley, right? Mm-hmm. If you come at it from the point of view of languages and so on. So that was all really quite remarkable, those comments.
And if you'll forgive me, Hortense and Gayatri, can we have leave that question in the air for the moment? And we have a few. I want to give our participants a chance to, our audience members a chance to ask things.
All right.
Can we hold that question for just a second? We have Danielle Prokop-Bell saying, first of all, thank you very much for your excellent talk, Dr. Spillers. Do you see any similarities between the curricular object of Black studies and the curricular object of, more specifically, Black feminist studies, in terms of both being potentially interpolated into the academy in a manner that privileges the white audience and white interests?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question. You know, I think that Black feminist studies and Black studies have always been complementary, yet there are times when if they don't radically differ, they certainly differ in ways that have from time to time made participants angry. I mean, I'm remembering circumstance where the males were playing the same patriarchal game that goes on all the time, everywhere. And we didn't think as Black women that we had to swear at people and get angry, but I've actually seen that. And what puzzles me, and I don't know how to explain this unless unless it's explained by what Gayatri referred to a moment ago as a bourgeois subject, or Du Bois preparing a middle class subject. My observation is that men of my father's generation, this was certainly my impression, that men of my father's generation did not fear Black women's power and did not hold them in contempt because they had loud mouths or talked a lot or were aggressive in certain kinds of ways or arms akimbo. They just kind of dealt with them. I'm thinking of a couple in my neighborhood when I was a child. They were both towering figures. They were both people well over 6 feet tall. They were close to 7 feet tall. And the woman had a voice that sounded like that, Mrs. Llewellyn. And her husband had a voice that sounded like that, Mr. Llewellyn, right? But I never got the impression that Mr. Llewellyn was intimidated for a moment by that very powerful wife of his. It seems to me that the picture changes by the time we get to my generation. I'm remembering that I had a disturbing conversation on the phone with a Black male colleague about a certain circumstance, and the colleague ended up asking me, well, what do you want me to do, Hortense? Is this about affirmative action? And I ended up hanging up the phone, right? I mean, I'm talking to a Black man who's asking me about affirmative action. What the hell was that about? So that was I see that as a generational shift. And I can't explain it except that perhaps the more urban and sophisticated the males got, the more they had different attitudes about the politics of gender. And I guess where all of that is in relationship to outside the academy, and I understand that that was Danielle's question. Wasn't that in her question? Was something about, there was a question about, I'm not putting it right. Outside is not quite it, but I understood it at the time you were reading the question. And I think this goes back to something else that Gayatri was saying. I mean, I think we have to be prepared to be in and out, right? We have to
here's the question, Hortense, the question, do you see any similarities between the curricular object of Black studies and the curricular object of more specifically Black feminist studies in terms of both being potentially interpolated into the academy in a manner that privileges a white audience and white interests?
Yeah. They are both similar and dissimilar. I mean, I think in some ways, women have their feet on the ground a little bit more. I would say that much in terms of a curriculum, and I think probably the Black feminists are more suspicious of white audiences, the settlement, the location in the academy. They are not convinced that the politics of gatekeeping is the thing that that they should do. I see Black feminist work really as a Black studies critique,
Mhm.
and it's always been that, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Here's a question from Desmond Coleman, who says, if Du Bois is exemplary of proto-traditional pre-1960s impulses in Black studies, who is exemplary of iconoclastic radical Black studies post-1960?
Before Hortense answers, I just want to say Angela Davis. Now Hortense, go.
Angela Davis is a very good example. Yeah, I would go with that. And I would also say that maybe there are several such figures, and more than one. And the fact that we had a Du Bois made it possible for us to have today more than one, right? I mean, to have multiple radical possibilities.
It's good. Michael Washington asks a question about having become a standard reading. How does it feel? He says, not so much how does it feel to become a figure of canonicity, but do you think there's still a future for theory today in ways we've known it, or has theory in the ways it has been transmitted since 1976 had its time?
Has it had its time? I think that we will always have theory with us if theory is the distance that one strikes between herself and something that she's interested in. I mean, I think in a sense, the theoretical posture is the stepping back posture. I mean, it's the contemplative, meditative posture. And they're theoretical fashions, but I think in some ways, theory is something that we always have with us, or we couldn't live our lives, right? I mean, one has to be contemplative at the same time that one is strategic. One is idealistic at the same time that one is pragmatic. One is a number of things at once, and I think the theoretical dimension is just is one of those. I mean, it's reified as particular moments, but I think that there's another way to look at it, that we can look at it in a way that might be a little more democratic or fluid or porous, right? So that theory is something that must be done. Theory is something that is missing from those millions of people who choose to believe a lie about what happened in November, right? I mean, they're striking no distance between themselves and this person, God knows why, they adore, right? So it's a kind of interface. That's the way I think of the theoretical, in the sense that I'm meaning it in. Right?
Someone has read Hortense, your comments on Toni Morrison's Sula, and asks, Dr. Spillers, could you speak of the role of Toni Morrison's Sula in your development of a strategy or method of approach in Black women's studies?
Bob, can I just say one thing before Hortense answers? This question about theory was also, to me, Can I very briefly answer it, and then Hortense can go to the other one, because I have a completely different idea of theory. I was Paul Demand's student, and Paul Demand was asked by the MLA to write a little book on theory, and they didn't accept it because Paul Demand said that theory is constituted by its own resistance, that we must resist this impulse to have capital T theory. My feeling is that theorization is a practice, and that theorization is a halfway house. It is always normed when you get into the field of practice. Everyone theorizes, whether they know it or not. That is an event. But then there is a second degree, which is a task, which is theorization, making visible the truth of something as a task. So I won't say more, there's much more to say, but I really have been very active in resisting the idea of capital T theory. And also I will say that if you look at Harold Wieser's book on on theoreticians, you'll see that I keep to my word. Everybody goes on talking about how wonderful, by the way, there's not a black face in there. I really noticed that. Everyone goes on talking about how wonderfully they have the 1966 structuralist controversy, this, that. But my thing is, my interview is 2 pages long, and all I say is, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. So if you want to, you can take a look. I forget the title of the book now, Harold Wieser. So you can't put it on the thing, but Harold Wieser, you see that. So I'm in fact someone who has been taught by someone who thinks theory must be resisted as it begins to congeal. And that's how I try to teach.
I see. Yeah, I was asked to introduce that book after everybody, the Black people were left out. And I said, no, I didn't. Yeah, but I know the text you're referring to.
Amazing.
Yeah. And the question about Sula. I think what Sula taught me was that negative capability was acceptable or all right for Black women to have. I mean, in other words, Sula is not lovable, loving, forgiving, generous. Sula is the figuration of Sula is not any of those things. And what that does in effect is sort of open up the repertoire for possibility. Now, it's not anything necessarily that I would choose to be, but in thinking about Black women and Black woman personality, you now have to think about the possibility of a Sula, and I think that's a gain, right?
Without question, Hortense, again, the kind of meanness of Sula, it might not be anything that you or most people want to be, but I think what Morrison's understanding of writing as a way of thinking, as a kind of coherence, not quite theory, but as a way of orienting one's mind and a way of coming into knowledge. Her invention of Sula gives us woman license, Black woman license to be who the hell they want to be. That instance of self-fabrication stays with us until this very hour,
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that. Yeah.
And might I say, by way of a bridge between the theory question and the question about theory, we need to engage the artworks in a serious way. And as soon as we do that, the two of you, and with the three of you, have been theorizing, and two of you, as you've talked about Sula. And we need that kind of examination. I went to graduate school at a point when we pretended that there wasn't any theory, that all we needed was the poem and a dictionary. And when it's hidden, I think it can be most insidious. It's always there. And to make sure that it is insight and that we're using it in a way that is creative and productive and change-oriented, I think is the challenge. And what's so wonderful about the work that the three of you do is that it's not just spinning your wheels, theoretically enjoying kind of escape, but engaging in a way that's fierce and challenging and change producing.
Yeah.
We have a question from Henry Washington, who starts by thanking Professor Spillers for your evocative talk. Amid an onslaught of cluster hires, statements of solidarity, departmentalizations, etc., should the incorporability of the contemporary Black Studies project arouse anxiety in its practitioners? Does the popularity and mobility of its theoretical claims signal a critical and/or political failure? Is it necessary to reassess and subsequently propagate Black Studies' delinquent possibilities?
Delinquent possibilities. What, say that last part again, Bob?
Is it necessary to reassess and to subsequently propagate Black Studies' delinquent possibilities?
Okay. Is delinquent possibilities a reference to radicalness? Do you know? I wonder. Okay. You know, I'm thinking about what Gayatri just said a moment ago about her interview in this text. How she said more than once, "I don't know." In relationship to this question, I want to say, I don't know. I am of two minds about Black Studies. I always have been, and I remain that way. That what we do in Black Studies in a university can, to go back to another point Gayatri makes about the task, can only be done, I'm thinking, in the university, and it should be done in the university. If the university is constituted in ways that I'm thinking in my head, but maybe it's no longer constituted in that way. I mean, there's certain questions that we are answering or trying to answer in the university or trying to pose in the university. And Black Studies is very much a part of that process and should be. But I think needing to look at your practice is probably not something that we have done enough of, and I think that's where the settling comes in. That's where the taking for granted or resting on your laurels or we have arrived. That's where that comes in, and that's what I'm interested in avoiding, because I think that's what kills inquiry. That's what kills the commitment to reading. A lot of the work that we do today is standard operating procedure. If you get what I mean, it's slick, it's sophisticated, it's theoretically informed and so forth, but it's superficial, some of it. And that bothers me quite a lot. So that when I talk about the mantle of prophecy, I'm talking about going deeper than something that's just, as Ralph Ellison talks about it in Little Man at Cheehaw Station, when he is playing before Hazel Harrison, and he's doing fancy things with his lips. And the teacher says, "Stop it. You're not fooling anyone. I know what you're doing. And you're not doing that very well. And you will live in a world where there is always in your audience a little man at Cheehaw Station who knows the text better than you And so what you need to do is assume greater humility in your presentation and learn your skills, right? I mean, learn your licks. And so I'm thinking that the work that we do in Black studies or whatever the studies is needs to be work where we are mindful of the lessons learned or the lessons taught from little man, right? That you always perform as best you can and not high wiring it, you know, or doing something that's just about the dance or performance alone, but it has some other register or resonance or significance. I think that's the way I would answer that.
I think it's time for me to thank our participants and to take one moment to say that for me this has been an especially moving encounter. Moving both in the sense that it's just great to hear such beautiful minds at work, but also disturbing and encouraging us to think again about what it means to be in a place where Black studies is becoming more settled. And at the same time, there's much work to do. There are ways of opening the lens so that it's more interdisciplinary, international, more welcoming, and at the same time is more aware of the dangers of becoming settled. And maybe you mentioned Fred Moten in the undercommons. Can we take this session as an invitation to be more and more mindful of the undercommons, of the place where we can find like-minded people who don't just want a settled curriculum where everybody's sort of satisfied reading the books that have now become canonical, but we really are trying to do, as Ellison was implying, to speak to the best person in the room that we might not see right away, and to plan together with that person to change things altogether, which is what we have to do. Hortense, I want to invite you to say a final word, if you would. Do you want to leave us with something, or shall we move along?
Well, I think ending with an Ellison word is terrific. I'm remembering, and I didn't have anywhere to insert this in the talk or in responding to the questions, and I'm not sure how appropriate it is now, but I'm remembering meeting Ralph Ellison once when I was at Brandeis. This was either before or after the building takeover. And I am remembering that we had a soul dinner with Black students. And Ralph Ellison, well, you know Ralph Ellison, right? I mean, Ralph Ellison was a take no prisoner guy. And Ralph Ellison could tell you why it was all right to say American Negro. all day about that. So at the dinner table that night, he got into it with some of my more hot-headed colleagues who were very upset that Ellison had not come off as a Black Panther. I mean, he had come off as Ralph Ellison. So I'm remembering a dear friend from Panama whom I saw at the reunion at Brandeis a couple of years ago was almost foaming at the mouth that night when Ralph Ellison was there. I don't see how anybody who wrote Invisible Man can have that man's ideas, right? So I guess I'm saying that
Oh wait, we're not hearing you, I don't think.
oh, You can hear me now, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. If we think of it as a kind of territory, right? That it has to be generous, right? And it's generous enough to have in it the Panthers, Ellison, Sula, people who agree, who disagree, who fight at least symbolically and with critical weapons. And if we ever lay down those arms, and I can think of a couple of places where people are giving up those arms in the name of being important professors. If we give up those arms, we've lost. We cannot give that up, and that is always pulling each other's coat, looking at our own practices, having a certain openness, a certain generosity that has to go along, and always a critical eye to where we are and where we're trying to go. Right? We can't give that up.
I think that's a very good benediction, and thanks to you all. Thanks again to Gayatri Spivak for her remarks, and thank you so much, Rich Flint, for your wonderful contribution, and thanks to our fabulous guests for inspiring us and for visiting us with such warmth and generosity. Good evening to everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and we look for you the next time we gather together. For now, good night.
Thanks to you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.